The ancestral seat of Calderfell had witnessed 3 centuries of winters, each one etching its presence into the pale stone walls and frost-weathered turrets that rose against the northern sky. It was a place built not for comfort, but for legacy, where every corridor whispered of duty and every portrait seemed to watch with silent judgment. The Caldermere lineage had been forged in restraint, tempered by expectation, and polished into a kind of perfection that left little room for the messiness of human emotion. For generations, the Dukes of Calderfell had understood that love was a luxury afforded to poets and second sons, not to men whose names carried the weight of history. Oswin Caldermere, 7th Duke of Calderfell, had learned this lesson before he could read. His father, a man of impeccable breeding and unshakable coldness, had died when Oswin was 14, leaving behind an empire of land, responsibility, and unspoken rules. Chief among them, a duke does not feel, he decides. He does not hope, he plans. He does not love recklessly, he marries strategically. By the time Oswin reached his 28th year, he had mastered every expectation placed upon him. He managed his estates with precision, spoke in Parliament with measured authority, and moved through London society with the grace of a man who had long ago learned to hide his heart behind courtesy. But even the most carefully constructed walls have cracks, and Oswin's had begun to form the moment Annalise Marchmont entered his life. It had been spring 5 years earlier, when his mother, the formidable Dowager Duchess Eleanor, had insisted on hosting a charity gala to raise funds for a hospital wing in the village. Oswin had attended out of obligation, his thoughts already drifting toward the estate ledgers waiting in his study. The ballroom had been filled with the usual assembly, lords in tailcoats discussing politics, ladies in pastel silks exchanging gossip, and an orchestra playing melodies designed to fill silence without demanding attention. He had moved through the evening with practiced ease, offering polite conversation to those who approached, and counting the minutes until propriety would allow him to withdraw. Then the speeches had begun, and everything changed. Annalise Marchmont had stepped forward, not onto a raised platform, for she lacked the vanity for such displays, but simply to the front of the room where candlelight caught the warm brown of her hair and illuminated the quiet determination in her eyes. She was the daughter of Viscount Marchmont, a family of respectable lineage but modest fortune, known more for their kindness than their influence. Oswin had seen her before at various gatherings, though never long enough to form an impression beyond pleasant and unassuming. But when she spoke, something shifted. She thanked the guests on behalf of the families who would benefit from their generosity. Her voice did not waver with false modesty, nor swell with performative emotion. Instead, it carried a sincerity so unguarded it seemed almost dangerous in a room where every word was typically measured for social advantage. She spoke of the village children who walked 3 miles to see a physician, of the elderly who suffered in silence because care was beyond their reach, of the simple truth that those gathered in that glittering ballroom held the power to ease suffering with nothing more than their willingness to act. When she finished and curtsied, the applause was polite and brief. The guests returned to their champagne. The orchestra resumed playing. Life continued as it always had. But Oswin remained motionless, his glass forgotten in his hand, his carefully maintained composure disrupted by the undeniable pull of something he could not name. Over the months that followed, that pull only strengthened. He found himself noticing her at events he had previously endured with detachment. At a musical hosted by Lady Pemberton, he watched Annalisa sit in the second row, her attention so fully absorbed by the music that she seemed unaware of the whispers and social maneuvering happening around her. At a garden party in Richmond, he observed her laughing with unrestrained delight as a tenant's child tried to catch butterflies, her joy unmarred by the self-consciousness that governed most interactions among the nobility. At a Sunday service, he saw her distribute flowers to the village children, with the same respect she would have shown a duchess. Each glimpse added another layer to the truth forming in his heart. Annalisa Marchmont was not like the carefully polished women of his social sphere. She possessed something rarer, an authenticity that made the world around her feel more vivid, more real. And with each encounter, Oswin felt the carefully constructed walls around his heart begin to crumble. He told himself it was mere admiration, nothing more, Admiration was safe, distant, appropriate for a man of his position, but admiration did not explain why his pulse quickened when her name appeared in correspondence from mutual acquaintances. It did not explain why he found himself asking his sister, Lady Caroline, about Annalise's interests and activities with a casualness that fooled no one. It did not explain why he began attending events he would have otherwise declined, hoping for even a brief conversation, a shared glance, some small confirmation that she saw him as more than just another titled nobleman moving through society's prescribed motions. But Oswin did not pursue her. How could he? The expectations surrounding his eventual marriage were clear. He needed a bride whose connections would strengthen his political influence, whose dowry would fund improvements to his estates, whose family name carried enough weight to satisfy the collective judgment of the peerage. Annalise, for all her grace and goodness, possessed none of these advantages. She was the daughter of a viscount whose fortunes had declined over the years, whose family was known for kindness rather than power, whose presence in his life would be seen by many as a romantic folly rather than a strategic alliance. So he had chosen silence. He had danced with her twice at the Harrington ball, the maximum number that suggested courtesy without particular interest. He had written polite letters to her family regarding mutual charitable endeavors. He had inquired after her health through appropriate intermediaries. He had done everything a gentleman of his station could do to remain present in her life without crossing the invisible boundaries that separated duty from desire. But silence, he discovered, did not diminish longing. It only sharpened it into something more persistent, more painful. By the 4th year of this unspoken devotion, Oswin had grown accustomed to the constant ache of loving someone from a distance, the way his thoughts drifted toward her during long meetings with his steward, the way he found himself wondering what books she was reading or what she thought about on quiet afternoons, the way he imagined conversations they might have had if circumstances were different. His mother had noticed, of course. The Dowager Duchess missed very little, and her son's unusual distraction had not escaped her sharp observation. One evening, as they sat in the library at Calderfell, she had set down her embroidery and studied him with eyes that saw too much. "You have been different these past years," she said without preamble, "quieter, more withdrawn." "I am as I have always been, Mother," Oswin replied, not looking up from the estate report he was pretending to read. "No," she said gently. "You have always been reserved, but this is something else. This is the silence of a man carrying a burden he will not share." He had wanted to deny it, to deflect with the practiced ease he employed in Parliament, but this was his mother, the woman who had raised him alone after his father's death, who had taught him that strength did not require cruelty and that duty could coexist with compassion. If anyone deserved his honesty, it was her. "There are some things," he said carefully, "that duty does not permit." Eleanor had been quiet for a long moment. Then she rose, crossed to where he sat, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "My son," she said softly, "I raised you to understand responsibility, but I did not raise you to confuse duty with imprisonment. Even dukes are permitted to want something beyond expectation." Those words had stayed with him, returning unbidden during long nights when sleep eluded him, and the weight of his title felt heavier than the ancient walls surrounding him. Even dukes are permitted to want, but wanting and having were different matters entirely, separated by centuries of tradition and the unforgiving judgment of a society that measured worth in bloodlines and bank accounts. Then came the winter of his 28th year, and with it, a shift as quiet and profound as the first snowfall. December arrived with unusual severity, bringing storms that turned the roads into ribbons of ice and blanketed Calderfell's vast grounds in white silence. London society began its annual migration to country estates for the holiday season, and Oswin found himself at Calderfell earlier than usual, released from his parliamentary duties and surrounded by the kind of solitude that forced a man to confront truths he had spent years avoiding. One evening, as he stood in his study watching snow fall against the darkness, something inside him finally broke, not with drama or despair, but with a quiet, irreversible certainty. He was tired of restraint, tired of measuring every word and gesture against the phantom approval of ancestors long dead, tired of living as if love were a weakness rather than the only thing that made the burden of his title bearable. He thought of Annalisa, of her kindness, her sincerity, the way she moved through the world with grace unforced by artifice. He thought of the years he had wasted maintaining a distance he no longer believed in, protecting a reputation that felt increasingly hollow, and he made a decision that would have horrified his father and surprised even his understanding mother. He would tell her. Not with a letter delivered by messenger, not with coded phrases whispered at a crowded ball, but honestly, completely, in a way that honored both the depth of his feeling and the respect she deserved. And he would do it at Christmas, a season when even the most rigid traditions softened slightly, when magic felt possible amid candlelight and evergreen. The plan formed with surprising clarity. He would invite her to Calderfell under the pretense of the annual Christmas charity distribution, an event she had participated in before, making the invitation unremarkable to outside observers. But once she arrived, he would create an evening unlike any other, one designed not to impress society, but to show her, without words, how deeply she mattered. And when the moment was right, he would ask the question that had lived unspoken in his heart for 5 years. The risk was considerable. If she refused him, and he acknowledged that possibility with the same clear-eyed assessment he brought to all important decisions, the consequences would extend beyond personal disappointment. His mother would be disappointed, society would gossip, his carefully maintained reputation for level-headed judgment would be questioned. But for the first time in his adult life, Oswin found that he did not care about any of that as much as he cared about the possibility, however slim, that Annalisa might say yes. He composed the invitation himself, writing and rewriting until the tone balanced courtesy with warmth, formality with genuine hope. When he finally sealed it and sent it via his most trusted footman, he felt something he had not experienced in years. Not the satisfaction of duty fulfilled, but the vulnerable, terrifying hope of a man who had finally chosen to risk his heart. The response arrived 3 days later, brief, gracious, accepting. Lady Annalise Marchmont would be honoured to assist with the Christmas charity distribution at Calderfell and gratefully accepted his invitation to stay for the holiday celebrations. Oswin read the letter 3 times, searching for any hint of her feelings beyond polite acceptance. Finding none, he carefully folded the paper and placed it in the locked drawer of his desk, alongside the few other items he considered truly precious: his mother's wedding ring, his father's final letter written hours before his death, and a pressed white rose from the garden party, where he had first admitted to himself that what he felt for Annalisa Marchmont was love. The preparations began immediately, though Oswin entrusted the details to only his most discreet servants. Mrs. Bellamy, the housekeeper who had served Calderfell since before his birth, received her instructions with knowing eyes, but asked no questions. The head gardener was tasked with cultivating winter roses in the conservatory, white ones, symbolizing both purity and new beginnings. The chef received a list of Annalise's favorite dishes, information Oswin had gathered over years of careful observation: roasted pheasant with herbs, honey-glazed carrots, a delicate lemon tart she had once mentioned enjoying at a summer party 3 years prior. His sister Caroline arrived at Calderfell a week before Christmas, ostensibly to help with the holiday preparations, but truly because Oswin had written to her with unusual candor. Caroline was 2 years his junior, possessed of their mother's perceptiveness and considerably less patience for propriety. She found him in the library on the evening of her arrival, still dressed in her travelling cloak, her expression caught between delight and exasperation. "So you have finally decided to stop being noble and miserable," she announced without preamble, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Mother wrote to me. Said you were planning something either very romantic or very foolish." "Perhaps both," Oswin admitted, setting aside the correspondence he had been attempting to focus on for the past hour. Caroline studied him with the frank assessment only a sister could employ. "You have loved her for years. Everyone knows it except possibly Lady Annalisa herself, who I suspect is either extraordinarily oblivious or has been waiting for you to find your courage." "I am a duke, Caroline. Courage in battle or parliament is expected. Courage in matters of the heart is considered unseemly. Only by people whose hearts have atrophied from disuse," she replied tartly. "You are not father, Oswin. You do not have to live as if emotion were a character flaw." The comparison stung because it was accurate. Their father had been a man of rigid principle and colder affection, who had viewed his children as extensions of the Caldermere legacy rather than individuals deserving of warmth. Oswin had spent his youth trying to earn approval that never came, learning too late that his father was incapable of giving what he had never received himself. The cycle of emotional restraint had been passed down through generations like an heirloom no one wanted, but everyone felt obligated to preserve. What if she refuses? The question emerged quieter than intended, revealing a vulnerability Oswin rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Caroline's expression softened. Then you will have risked your heart and survived, which is more than most men of your position can claim. But I do not think she will refuse. I have seen the way she looks at you when she believes no one is watching. There is something there, brother, something worth fighting for. Her words offered comfort, though doubt remained. Oswin had built his entire life on certainty, on ledgers that balanced, decisions supported by evidence, outcomes that could be reasonably predicted. Love offered none of these assurances. It demanded vulnerability without guarantee, faith without proof. For a man trained to control every variable, it was terrifying. But it was also, he realized, the only thing that mattered. The day of Annalise's arrival dawned cold and bright, the sun reflecting off fresh snow with almost blinding intensity. Oswin stood at the window of his chamber, watching the long drive for the first sign of her carriage. He had changed his cravat 3 times, earning an amused look from his valet, and was now questioning whether the dark blue coat or the charcoal grey better conveyed serious intent without excessive formality. "The blue, Your Grace," his valet suggested, with the practiced diplomacy of a man who had weathered countless aristocratic anxieties. "It brings out the grey in your eyes." Oswin was not certain when he had begun caring about such things, but he accepted the recommendation and tried to calm the unusual nervousness making his hands unsteady. He was a duke. He had addressed Parliament, managed complex estates, negotiated with powerful men who sought to manipulate him. Yet the prospect of seeing Annalise Marchmont descend from a carriage had reduced him to the uncertainty of a schoolboy. When the carriage finally appeared, drawn by matched bays and bearing the modest Marchmont crest, Oswin forced himself to wait a full minute before descending to the entrance hall. Arriving too quickly would reveal too much, but as he reached the great doors and saw her step onto the snow-dusted gravel, wrapped in a travelling cloak of deep green wool trimmed with white fur, every carefully rehearsed greeting vanished from his mind. She looked up at Calderfell with an expression of wonder that suggested she was seeing it truly for the first time, despite having visited before. The winter sun caught the bronze in her hair, and when she turned toward him, her smile was genuine, not the practiced curve of social obligation, but the natural warmth of someone genuinely pleased to be there. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying with practiced grace. "Thank you for your kind invitation. Calderfell is even more beautiful in winter than I remembered. Lady Annalise," he bowed, pleased that his voice remained steady. "The beauty of Calderfell is considerably enhanced by your presence. Welcome." A faint blush coloured her cheeks, whether from cold or his words he could not determine. Her lady's maid and a footman were unloading trunks, and the bustle of arrival precluded private conversation. But as Oswin offered his arm to escort her inside, he felt the light pressure of her gloved hand and allowed himself a moment of hope. The house had been transformed under Mrs. Bellamy's expert supervision. Evergreen garlands adorned every banister and door frame, tied with velvet ribbons in deep crimson and gold. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air, and in the great hall, an enormous fir tree stood decorated with candles, ribbons, and delicate glass ornaments collected over generations. It was traditional, elegant, and designed to evoke the warmth of celebration without excessive ostentation. "It is lovely," Annalise said softly, her gaze travelling over the decorations with genuine appreciation. "You have created something quite magical, Your Grace." "I cannot claim credit," he replied. "Mrs. Bellamy and my sister have orchestrated everything. I merely approved their plans." "Modest as always," Caroline announced, descending the main staircase with theatrical flair. "Annalise, how delightful to see you. Come, let me show you to your rooms. I have ensured you have the blue chamber with the best view of the gardens. The snow has made everything look like something from a fairy tale." As Caroline swept Annalise away with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops, Oswin was left standing in the entrance hall, already counting the hours until dinner, when he would see her again. His mother appeared at his elbow, having observed the entire exchange from the doorway of the drawing-room. "She is even lovelier than I remembered," Eleanor said quietly. "And the way she looked at you, my dear. There is affection there, even if she does not yet recognize its depth. I hope you are correct, Mother, because if this ends poorly, I shall have to exile myself to the Scottish estate for several years to escape the gossip." Eleanor laughed, a sound of pure delight. "Then we shall pray for your success and prepare for a wedding. I have waited quite long enough for grandchildren." The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. More guests arrived, neighbors from surrounding estates, a few carefully selected members of society who could be trusted not to turn the holiday into a circus of gossip, and several families from the village who would participate in the Christmas charity distribution. By tradition, the Duke of Calderfell provided gifts and provisions to his tenants each Christmas Eve, a practice Oswin had maintained and expanded since inheriting the title. Annalise threw herself into the preparations with the same wholehearted enthusiasm he had come to associate with her. She helped organize the gifts, spoke with the village children without condescension, and assisted his mother with last-minute arrangements for the evening's dinner. Watching her move through Calderfell as if she belonged there, Oswin felt certainty settle over him like a benediction. This was right. She was right. Whatever society might think, whatever obstacles existed, none of it mattered as much as the simple truth that Annalise Marchmont was the only woman he could imagine sharing his life with. Dinner that evening was a formal affair with 20 guests seated at the long table in the dining hall. Oswin, as host, sat at the head with his mother to his right and a visiting countess to his left. Annalise was seated further down, between Caroline and a baron's son who was pleasant enough, but utterly unable to hold her attention. Oswin found himself watching her throughout the meal, noting the way she listened with genuine interest when others spoke, the graceful movements of her hands, the occasional smile that seemed to light the entire room. "You are being obvious, brother," Caroline murmured during a lull in conversation, leaning close enough that only he could hear. "Every person at this table now suspects you are either ill or besotted. Given your generally robust health, they are drawing the logical conclusion." "Let them," Oswin replied with uncharacteristic recklessness. "Tomorrow, speculation will become certainty." After dinner, the guests retired to the drawing-room for music and cards. Oswin excused himself briefly, claiming estate business, but truly needing a moment of solitude to steady his nerves. He retreated to his study, poured a glass of brandy he did not drink, and stood before the fire trying to organize thoughts that refused to be organized. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. Tomorrow, after the charity distribution and the evening's festivities, he would ask Annalise to walk with him to the winter salon, a small intimate room he had spent days having prepared specifically for this moment. There, surrounded by candlelight and the silence of falling snow, he would tell her everything. That he had loved her for 5 years, that she had transformed his understanding of what life could be, that if she would honor him with her hand, he would spend the rest of his days proving himself worthy of her trust. And then he would wait for her answer, knowing that everything, his happiness, his future, the very course of his life, rested on her response. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come," he called, expecting his valet or perhaps a footman with some household matter. Instead, Annalise entered. She stood in the doorway, hesitant, as if uncertain whether her presence was welcome. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I was told you were here, and I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" He set down the untouched brandy, his full attention on her. "For what?" "For inviting me to Calderfell, for including me in something so meaningful as the Christmas charity, for—" She paused, searching for words. "For always treating me with such kindness, even when you had no obligation to do so." She could not possibly understand the irony of her words. No obligation, when every thought, every decision of the past 5 years had been oriented around her, shaped by the quiet, persistent hope that someday he might earn the right to stand beside her, not as a duke addressing a viscount's daughter, but as a man who loved her beyond reason or restraint. "The obligation has been mine," he said carefully, moving toward her but maintaining a respectful distance. "You have given Calderfell, and me, far more than kindness, Lady Annalisa. You have given us grace, warmth, and a reminder that some things matter more than duty or expectation." She looked at him with an expression he could not quite read, surprise, perhaps, or the first glimmer of understanding. "You speak as if I have done something extraordinary. I have merely been myself." "Precisely," he said softly, "and that is the most extraordinary thing of all." The moment stretched between them, weighted with words unspoken and feelings barely restrained. Oswin wanted desperately to say more, to close the distance, to take her hand and confess everything that lived in his heart. But not yet. Not here, in a study that smelled of leather and obligation. Tomorrow, in the place he had prepared, with the care and ceremony she deserved. "I should return to the drawing-room," Annalisa said finally, though she made no move toward the door. "Your guests will wonder where I have gone." "Let them wonder," Oswin replied, then caught himself. "Forgive me. That was "No," she interrupted gently. "It was honest, and I find I prefer honesty to propriety when given the choice." She left then, her departure as quiet as her arrival, leaving Oswin alone with the fire and the growing certainty that tomorrow would change everything. Either he would gain the future he had spent 5 years imagining, or he would lose the illusion that had sustained him. Either outcome would require more courage than he had ever needed before. But for Annalisa Marchmont, for the possibility of loving her openly rather than in silence, he would find that courage. The snow fell heavier that night, blanketing Calderfell in a silence broken only by the occasional crack of settling logs and the distant sound of church bells from the village. Oswin stood at his chamber window long after the household had retired, watching white flakes drift past glass, and whispered a prayer to whatever forces governed the hearts of men and the grace of women. Tomorrow, the silence would end. Tomorrow, everything would be decided. Christmas Eve dawned with the kind of crystalline stillness that makes the world feel newly created. Frost had painted elaborate patterns across every window at Calderfell, transforming glass into lace, and the snow that had fallen throughout the night lay pristine and undisturbed across the estate's vast grounds. From his chamber window, Oswin watched dawn break over the white landscape, each ray of pale sunlight striking ice and snow until the entire world seemed to shimmer with possibility. He had not slept well. Hours had passed in restless contemplation, his mind alternating between careful planning and unbridled anxiety. Every detail of the evening ahead had been arranged with meticulous precision, yet he knew that no amount of preparation could guarantee the outcome he desperately hoped for. Love, unlike estate management or parliamentary strategy, refused to yield to logic or control. It demanded vulnerability, faith, and the courage to accept that some things could not be orchestrated, only offered. By the time his valet arrived to assist with dressing, Oswin had already been awake for hours, reviewing mental lists and second-guessing decisions that could no longer be altered. The dark green coat he had selected days earlier now seemed too formal. The cravat arranged with perfect precision felt constricting. Even his reflection in the mirror appeared somehow wrong, too pale, too serious, betraying every anxious thought, churning beneath his carefully maintained exterior. "You look every inch a duke, preparing for something significant, Your Grace," his valet observed with the quiet diplomacy that came from decades of service. "If I may be so bold, matters of the heart require confidence as much as precision. The lady will see what you intend, regardless of which waistcoat you choose." Oswin managed a faint smile. "Is my purpose so transparent, then? To those who have had the honor of serving you these many years? Yes, Your Grace, and if I may add, it is about time." The unexpected endorsement steadied something in Oswin's chest. He was not alone in this risk. The people who knew him best, who had watched him move through life with dutiful restraint, understood what this evening represented. They wanted this for him. Perhaps that collective hope could offset the fear currently threatening to overwhelm his composure. Breakfast was served in the smaller morning room, where winter sunlight flooded through tall windows and reflected off polished silver. Most of the house guests had not yet risen, still recovering from the previous evening's festivities, but Oswin's mother sat at the table reading correspondence, and Caroline was attacking a plate of eggs and toast with characteristic enthusiasm. "You look dreadful, brother," Caroline announced cheerfully as he entered. "Did you sleep at all?" "Some," he lied, accepting coffee from a footman and taking his customary seat. Eleanor set down her letters and studied her son with maternal concern. "Today is a significant day, my dear, for the tenants certainly, but also for you. Are you prepared?" The question carried layers of meaning. Prepared for the charity distribution? Yes, those arrangements had been handled weeks ago. Prepared to confess 5 years of unspoken devotion to a woman who might not reciprocate his feelings? That was considerably more complicated. "I am as prepared as any man can be when his entire future hangs on a single answer," Oswin said quietly, abandoning pretense. Eleanor reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Then you are braver than your father ever was, and I am proud of you. Whatever happens tonight, Oswin, you will have done what he never could, chosen love over expectation. That matters." The words settled over him like a blessing, easing some of the tension that had coiled tight in his chest since waking. His father had been a cautionary tale, a man so imprisoned by duty that he had never allowed himself joy, warmth, or genuine connection. Oswin had spent years trying to honor that legacy, only to realize that the greatest honor he could offer was to choose differently, to break the cycle of emotional restraint that had made Caldermere men formidable but profoundly lonely. Annalisa appeared shortly thereafter, her presence transforming the morning room the way sunlight transforms shadow. She wore a day dress of soft grey wool trimmed with cream lace, her hair arranged simply, and when she smiled in greeting, Oswin felt his carefully rehearsed composure threaten to dissolve entirely. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the gentle warmth he had come to associate with her. "I hope I have not kept everyone waiting. The view from my chamber was so beautiful I could not help but linger." "You could never be anything but welcome, whenever you choose to grace us with your presence," Oswin replied, then caught himself. The words had emerged more revealing than intended, colored by emotion he was not yet ready to fully expose. But Annalisa only smiled, a faint blush touching her cheeks as she accepted coffee and took the seat Caroline hastily vacated with barely concealed delight at the awkwardness she had witnessed. The morning progressed in a blur of activity that did little to calm Oswin's nerves. The charity distribution was scheduled for early afternoon, and final preparations consumed everyone's attention. Gifts had been organized by family, provisions packed into baskets, and the great hall transformed into a reception space where tenants would be welcomed with warmth befitting the season. Oswin found himself stealing glances at Annalisa throughout the morning, as she moved efficiently through tasks, her natural grace and genuine kindness evident in every interaction. She spoke with the housekeeper about ribbon placement, helped Caroline organize children's toys by age, and laughed warmly when a footman nearly dropped an entire basket of oranges. She belonged here, Oswin thought with sudden clarity, not as a guest or charitable volunteer, but as mistress of Calderfell, as his duchess, as the woman whose presence transformed these ancient halls from a monument to duty into something that felt remarkably like home. The tenants began arriving shortly after noon, families trudging through snow to reach the great hall where warmth, food and gifts awaited. It was a tradition stretching back generations, one Oswin had maintained and expanded because he understood that nobility carried obligations beyond mere title. These were the people whose labor sustained Calderfell, whose lives were inextricably bound to the estate's fortunes, and they deserved recognition, respect, and genuine care. Annalisa was radiant throughout the distribution, kneeling to speak with children at eye level, asking elderly tenant farmers about their health with genuine interest, remembering names and details from previous years. Watching her, Oswin understood with perfect certainty that his choice was not merely right for him, but right in every possible way. She possessed the qualities that truly mattered: compassion, sincerity, strength tempered with kindness. Society might question his selection based on bloodlines and bank balances, but society measured worth with flawed instruments. As afternoon faded toward evening, and the last families departed with thanks and warm wishes, Calderfell settled into the hushed anticipation that precedes significant events. The houseguests retired to rest before dinner. Servants moved through corridors with final preparations, and Oswin retreated to his study, ostensibly to review estate matters, but truly to gather courage for what lay ahead. The winter salon waited, transformed according to his precise instructions. He had inspected it that morning alone, standing in the doorway and trying to see it through Annalise's eyes. Would she understand what he was attempting to communicate through candlelight and roses, through music, drifting from distant rooms, through the deliberate intimacy of a space designed for two people rather than crowds? Would she recognize the care embedded in every detail, the silent language of devotion that he had never been brave enough to speak aloud? Mrs. Bellamy found him there, staring at the room as if it held answers to questions he had not yet formed. "It is perfect, Your Grace," she said gently. "Any woman would be honored to receive such attention. You have created something beautiful. But will it be enough?" The question escaped before he could restrain it, revealing the vulnerability churning beneath ducal composure. "Your Grace, if I may speak plainly?" She waited for his nod. "I have served this house for 40 years. I watched your father live and die without ever allowing himself to feel deeply, to want freely. You are not him. What you are attempting tonight, this honest expression of love, is worth more than any amount of strategic marriages or proper alliances. It is human, real, and desperately needed in a world too often governed by calculation rather than heart." Her words struck deep, offering unexpected comfort. Oswin had spent so many years viewing emotion as weakness that he had forgotten it could also be strength, perhaps the only strength that truly mattered when measured against mortality and the inevitable question of what one's life had meant. Dinner that evening was more elaborate than the previous night's meal, befitting Christmas Eve tradition. The dining hall glowed with candles, evergreen garlands adorned every surface, and crystal glasses caught light like captured stars. 20 guests sat at table, conversation flowing with the easy warmth of people celebrating together. Oswin played his role as host with practiced skill, but his attention remained fixed on Annalise, seated several places away, her laughter rising above polite conversation like music. She wore evening dress of deep blue silk that made her eyes seem darker, more luminous. Someone had woven tiny white flowers through her hair, and when candlelight struck the arrangement just right, she looked like something from a painting, ethereal, impossibly beautiful, and yet somehow entirely real. Every time their eyes met across the table, Oswin felt the weight of unspoken words pressing against his chest, demanding release. After dinner, guests retired to the ballroom, where an orchestra played seasonal music and couples moved through formal dances. Oswin dutifully partnered with several ladies as social obligation demanded, but his thoughts remained elsewhere. The evening was advancing, time flowing forward with relentless momentum toward the moment when he would either claim his future or lose it entirely. Caroline materialized at his elbow during a waltz intermission. "Now, brother, if you wait any longer, you will lose your courage," and she keeps glancing toward the doors as if waiting for something or someone. She was right. Oswin took a steadying breath, crossed the ballroom with deliberate purpose, and stopped before Annalise, where she stood conversing with his mother. Both women looked up, and Eleanor's knowing smile told him she understood precisely what was about to unfold. "Lady Annalise," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos of his heartbeat, "would you grant me the honor of your company for a moment? There is something I wish to show you." Uncertainty flickered across her features, but she placed her gloved hand in his extended one. "Of course, Your Grace." He led her from the ballroom, aware of curious glances following their departure, but beyond caring what conclusions guests might draw. They moved through corridors made magical by candlelight and garlands, their footsteps muffled by carpets, the sounds of music and conversation fading behind them. Neither spoke, but the silence felt charged with possibility, weighted with questions hovering just beyond words. When they reached the winter salon, Oswin paused before the closed door. "Before we enter," he said quietly, "I must tell you that what waits beyond this threshold was created specifically for you. A gift, perhaps, or a confession. Possibly both." Her eyes widened slightly, reflecting candlelight. Oswin. The use of his given name, unguarded and intimate, nearly undid him. He opened the door. The winter salon glowed like something from a dream. Dozens of candles burned in careful arrangement, their collective light soft and golden. White roses filled crystal vases, their perfume delicate on the air. The curtains had been drawn back to reveal floor-to-ceiling windows, where snow fell steadily against darkness, each flake visible in candlelight before vanishing into shadow. At the room's center, a small table waited, set for two, covered in ivory linen and holding covered dishes that promised intimacy rather than formality. Annalisa drew in a sharp breath, one hand rising to her throat. "This is... Oswin, what is this?" "A truth 5 years delayed," he said quietly, closing the door behind them. "And a question I should have asked long ago if I had possessed sufficient courage." She turned to face him fully, confusion and something that might have been hope warring in her expression. "I do not understand." "Then allow me to explain." Oswin gestured toward the table. "Please sit with me. Let me offer you dinner and honesty, both of which you deserve." They settled into chairs facing each other, the table an intimate barrier between them. Servants had left the food covered, understanding without being told that this meal required complete privacy. Oswin had no appetite whatsoever, but he went through the motions of serving, buying himself moments to organize thoughts that refused coherent arrangement. "You once told me," he began finally, setting down serving utensils with care, "that you preferred honesty to propriety when given the choice. Do you remember?" "Yes," she said softly. "Last night, in your study." "Then I will be honest now, even if honesty risks everything I have spent 5 years protecting." He met her gaze directly, abandoning the careful control that had governed his entire adult life. "I love you, Annalisa. I have loved you since the evening you spoke at my mother's charity gala, though I did not recognize the feeling immediately for what it was. I have loved you through every subsequent encounter, every letter, every glimpse across crowded ballrooms. I have loved you in silence because I believed duty forbade me from speaking, because I feared society's judgment, because I had been taught that dukes do not risk their hearts for something as unpredictable as love." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not look away. "Oswin, please," he continued gently, "let me finish before courage fails me. I have arranged this evening, this room, this dinner, this moment, to show you something words alone cannot convey. That you matter. That you have transformed my understanding of what life can be. That if given the choice between strategic alliance and genuine love, I choose love. I choose you. Not because you bring wealth or political advantage, but because you bring warmth, sincerity, grace, and every quality that makes existence bearable rather than merely endured." He stood, moved around the table, and knelt beside her chair. A duke abandoning dignity for something infinitely more valuable. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet case, aged and precious, holding the ring his grandfather had given his grandmother in an era when Caldermere men had not yet forgotten how to love openly. "Annalise Marchmont," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I am asking you to marry me, not as a matter of social obligation or family expectation, but because I cannot imagine spending another day pretending my heart belongs anywhere but with you. Will you have me? Not as Duke of Calderfell, but simply as Oswin, a man who has finally found courage enough to want freely rather than merely duty correctly." For a long moment she could not speak, tears flowing freely now, her hands trembling as they rose to cover her mouth. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said the word that changed everything. "Yes." The world contracted to that single syllable, that affirmation of impossible hope made real. Oswin slipped the ring onto her finger, simple gold set with a sapphire the exact color of winter sky, and when she extended her hands to cup his face, drawing him upward, their kiss tasted of salt and joy, and 5 years of unspoken longing, finally given voice. "I have loved you too," she whispered against his lips. "So quietly I barely admitted it to myself, because I believed you could never see me as anything more than a Viscount's daughter, useful for charitable work. But I have watched you, Oswin. I have seen your kindness, your honor, the loneliness you hide so carefully, and I have hoped, foolishly perhaps, that someday you might look at me and see more than duty or politeness." "I see everything," he replied, resting his forehead against hers. "I see the woman who has made these cold halls feel like home, who has taught me that strength and gentleness need not be opposites, who has given me reason to believe that love is not weakness, but the only thing worth risking everything to claim." They remained there, kneeling together beside the table as candles burned low and snow continued its patient accumulation beyond the windows. Eventually they rose, hands clasped, and stood before the glass watching winter transform the world into something pristine and new, much like the future that now stretched before them, unwritten and full of possibility. "What happens now?" Annalisa asked softly. "Now," Oswin replied, "we return to the ballroom and announce our engagement. Society will gossip, my peers will calculate political implications, and your family will either celebrate or despair depending on their ambitions for your future. But none of that matters because we will face it together." She turned to him, eyes bright. "Together," she repeated, as if testing the word's weight and finding it perfect. They made their way back through Calderfell's corridors, no longer separate but joined, and when they entered the ballroom where guests still danced and conversed, Eleanor took one look at their clasped hands and linked expressions and began to smile. Caroline actually laughed aloud, and somewhere in the distance church bells began to ring, marking midnight's arrival and Christmas Day's beginning. Oswin raised his hand for silence, and the room gradually quieted, all attention turning toward the Duke, who had always maintained such careful emotional distance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, "I am pleased to announce that Lady Annalisa Marchmont has honored me by accepting my proposal of marriage. We will wed in the spring here at Calderfell, and I hope you will all join us in celebrating what has been for me the culmination of 5 years' worth of silent devotion, finally brave enough to speak its name." The ballroom erupted in applause and exclamations. Some reactions were genuine delight, others barely concealed surprise that the reserved Duke of Calderfell had chosen love over calculated advantage. But Oswin paid little attention to any of it, his entire focus on the woman beside him, whose smile outshone every candle in the room. Later, after guests had retired and Calderfell settled into Christmas quiet, Oswin and Annalisa stood together on the terrace, wrapped in fur-lined cloaks, watching snow fall through darkness. "Thank you," she said softly, "for creating something so beautiful, for trusting me with your heart." "I should thank you," he replied, "for seeing past the title to the man, for teaching me that duty and desire need not be enemies, for giving me courage to choose differently than every Caldermere man before me." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, marveling at how natural it felt, this closeness, this ease, this sense of rightness that had nothing to do with social advantage and everything to do with genuine connection. Above them, stars broke through clouds, and somewhere in the village, Christmas hymns rose on winter air. The Duke of Calderfell, who had spent 28 years learning restraint, had finally discovered something infinitely more valuable: the liberating power of loving openly, honestly, without fear or hesitation. And in the woman beside him, he had found not just a wife, but a partner, an equal, and the answer to questions he had not known how to ask until she had walked into his life and transformed silence into song. Christmas morning arrived, wrapped in the kind of profound stillness that follows significant change. The world beyond Calderfell's ancient walls remained blanketed in pristine snow, but within those walls, everything had transformed. The very air seemed different, lighter somehow, as if the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for generations. Oswin woke to sunlight streaming through frost-etched windows and the immediate, overwhelming awareness that his life had irrevocably changed. Annalisa had said yes. The woman he had loved in silence for 5 years had agreed to become his duchess, his wife, his partner in all things. The ring he had placed on her finger the previous night now bound them together in a promise that transcended social obligation and entered the realm of sacred commitment. He lay still for a moment, watching dust motes dance in morning light, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of his happiness. For so many years he had measured his days by duty fulfilled and obligations met, moving through life with the careful precision of a man who believed emotion was liability rather than strength. But this morning duty felt distant and irrelevant compared to the simple, overwhelming truth that he would spend the rest of his life loving Annalisa openly rather than in tortured silence. He rose and dressed with unusual care, selecting a deep burgundy waistcoat. His valet had long insisted brought warmth to his complexion. Today, appearances mattered not because of duty, but because he would see Annalisa at breakfast, would watch sunlight catch the sapphire on her hand, would begin navigating their new reality as an engaged couple rather than a duke and a guest maintaining appropriate distance. His valet Patterson, who had served him for 15 years and witnessed the entire evolution of his silent devotion, smiled as he adjusted Oswin's cravat. "If I may be so bold, Your Grace, you look like a man who has finally found his purpose. It suits you remarkably well." "Thank you, Patterson. I feel as though I have been living in shadow and only now discovered what sunlight means. Lady Annalisa will make an extraordinary duchess, if I may say so. The staff is already quite devoted to her. She remembers names, asks after families, treats everyone with genuine respect rather than condescending kindness. Calderfell has needed that warmth for longer than I care to admit." The observation touched Oswin deeply. His household's approval mattered more than society's judgment, because these were the people who would witness his marriage daily, who would see beyond performance to reality. That they already embraced Annalisa confirmed what his heart had known for years. She belonged here, not as ornament or strategic acquisition, but as genuine partner in the life and legacy of Calderfell. The household was already stirring when he descended to the breakfast room. Servants moved through corridors with barely suppressed smiles, their efficiency tempered by obvious delight. Mrs. Bellamy had outdone herself with the morning's offerings, fresh pastries, preserves, poached eggs, and Christmas ham, arranged with the care typically reserved for state dinners. It was clear that every member of the Calderfell staff had embraced the news of his engagement with genuine enthusiasm. His mother sat at the table already, reading correspondence with a satisfied expression that suggested she had been waiting years for precisely this outcome. When Oswin entered, she set down her letters and smiled with maternal warmth that transcended aristocratic reserve. "Good morning, my darling son," Eleanor said, the endearment carrying weight she rarely allowed herself. "Or should I say good morning to the happiest man in all of England?" "That would not be an exaggeration, Mother," Oswin replied, accepting coffee and taking his seat. "Though I confess I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I feared I would wake to discover the entire evening had been an elaborate dream. I assure you it was quite real. I have already received 3 notes this morning from guests expressing their congratulations, and in one case, their barely concealed shock that the famously reserved Duke of Calderfell had chosen romance over strategic alliance." Eleanor's eyes sparkled with amusement. Lady Pemberton was particularly surprised. "I believe she had been positioning her niece for your consideration for the past 2 seasons. Lady Pemberton's niece is a perfectly pleasant young woman who deserves a husband capable of loving her," Oswin said mildly. "I was never that man. My heart was otherwise engaged." "For 5 years," his mother observed with gentle reproach. "I knew, of course, mothers always know, but I am glad you finally found the courage to act on your feelings. Your father never did, and I watched him live a half-life governed entirely by expectation. You have chosen better, my son, and I could not be more proud." The conversation was interrupted by Caroline, bursting into the breakfast room with characteristic lack of ceremony, still in her dressing gown, her hair hastily pinned. "Is she awake yet? Has anyone seen her? I want to hear everything. Every word, every gesture, every romantic detail. You have been too proper to share in public." "Caroline," Eleanor chided gently, though her smile betrayed amusement, "your brother is entitled to some privacy regarding his proposal." "Nonsense. He has been silently pining for half a decade, while the rest of us watched in sympathetic agony." The least he can do is provide his sister with a thorough account of how he finally overcame his ridiculous commitment to restraint. Caroline helped herself to toast and jam with the enthusiasm of someone who had stayed up far too late celebrating. "Well, I am waiting. What did you say? How did she react? Was there weeping?" "I imagine there was weeping. Annalisa strikes me as someone who would weep beautifully." Oswin found himself smiling, genuinely, unguardedly, in a way he could not remember doing in years. "She said yes, Caroline. That is the only detail that matters." "That is absolutely not the only detail that matters, but I suppose I shall have to extract the romantic particulars from Annalisa herself." Caroline bit into her toast with satisfaction. "I'm already planning the wedding, spring, you said. That gives us several months to organize something appropriately magnificent without being ostentatious. Every eligible woman in London will be weeping into her tea, but that cannot be helped. They had their chances and failed to capture my brother's attention." The breakfast room door opened again, and all conversation stopped. Annalisa stood in the doorway, dressed in a morning gown of soft rose-colored wool that made her complexion glow, her hair arranged simply but elegantly, and on her hand, catching light and drawing every eye, the sapphire ring that proclaimed her new status. She looked uncertain, as if unsure of her welcome in this family gathering, her eyes seeking Oswin's with a vulnerability that made his heart ache with protective tenderness. He rose immediately and crossed to her with deliberate purpose, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips, in a gesture that was both formally correct and deeply intimate. "Good morning," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I trust you slept well." "Barely at all," she admitted, her smile trembling slightly. "I kept waking convinced I had imagined everything, until I saw the ring and remembered it was real. Even now, standing here, I half expect to discover this is an elaborate dream." "It is very real," he assured her, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm and leading her to the table. "As real as my love for you, as permanent as my commitment to our future together. You are not dreaming, my dear. You are home." The words seemed to settle something in her expression. She exhaled slowly and allowed him to seat her, accepting coffee and a plate with hands that trembled only slightly. Eleanor immediately engaged her in warm conversation about wedding plans, deliberately creating space for Annalisa to find her footing in this new dynamic where she was no longer guest but family. Caroline made a noise somewhere between a sigh and a squeal. "You are both disgustingly romantic, and I could not be more delighted. Annalisa, come sit beside me after breakfast. We have a wedding to plan, and I refuse to allow my brother's natural inclination toward restraint to result in anything less than the celebration you deserve. Though I must say, Oswin, you performed admirably last night. Mother told me about the winter salon. Quite inspired, brother." The morning progressed with the easy warmth of family absorbing a new member. Eleanor treated Annalisa with the affection she would show a daughter, discussing plans and preferences with genuine interest rather than the cool assessment often employed by aristocratic mothers-in-law protecting family legacy. Caroline peppered Annalisa with questions about favorite flowers, preferred music, and whether she envisioned a large society wedding or something more intimate. And Oswin simply watched, marveling at how naturally she fit into his family, how her presence seemed to complete something he had not realized was incomplete. The houseguests began appearing shortly thereafter, offering congratulations that ranged from heartfelt to calculating. Some genuinely celebrated the match, recognizing the obvious affection between the newly engaged couple. Others assessed political and social implications with the cold precision of those who viewed marriage as transaction rather than union. Oswin accepted all reactions with equal courtesy, secure in the knowledge that external opinions mattered far less than the woman whose hand he now held openly rather than in secret. Lord Ashworth, an elderly peer who had known 3 generations of Caldermere dukes, approached Oswin in the drawing-room after breakfast. His weathered face was thoughtful rather than judgmental, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of 8 decades of observation and experience. "Your grandfather would have approved," Ashworth said quietly, drawing Oswin aside from the general conversation. "He married your grandmother against considerable family opposition because he loved her. My own father tried to dissuade him, argued that he needed a bride with better connections. But your grandfather told him that 40 years with a woman he loved mattered more than 400 years of family approval. They had 47 years together before she passed, and he never regretted his choice for a single moment. You have his courage, young man. Use it wisely and your life will be infinitely richer than those who choose security over affection. The words settled over Oswin like a benediction, confirmation that his decision, however it might be viewed by society's more mercenary elements, honored a tradition older and more valuable than strategic alliance. Love had always existed within the Calderfell line. It had simply been suppressed by men too afraid to claim it openly. His grandfather had been the exception, and now Oswin would follow that braver path rather than his father's cautious restraint. "Thank you, Lord Ashworth," Oswin said sincerely. "Your words mean more than you can know. I have spent too many years believing duty and desire were enemies. I am learning they can be partners." "Indeed they can, when you choose wisely. And you, my boy, have chosen very wisely indeed. That young lady has more genuine quality in her smallest finger than half the eligible heiresses in London possess in their entire beings. Treasure her, and you will never want for anything that truly matters." By midday the snow had stopped, and pale sunlight transformed Calderfell's grounds into something from a winter fairy tale. Oswin suggested a walk, and Annalisa accepted with obvious relief at escaping the well-meaning but overwhelming attention of houseguests. They bundled into warm cloaks, his a deep charcoal wool, hers lined with soft fur that framed her face beautifully, and ventured onto the terrace, their breath visible in cold air, footsteps crunching through snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds under winter sun. For a time they walked in comfortable silence, following the garden path that wound through bare rose bushes that would bloom gloriously come summer, past the frozen fountain where summer birds had once gathered, and toward the old orchard where gnarled apple trees stood skeletal against the pale sky. The world felt hushed, expectant, as if nature itself was holding space for them to begin defining what their future would look like. "I still cannot quite believe this is real," Annalisa said finally, her gloved hand tucked securely into the crook of his arm. "Yesterday I was simply a guest at your Christmas gathering, uncertain of my place, trying not to reveal feelings I believed were hopeless. Today I am your betrothed, your future Duchess. It feels like stepping into someone else's life, as though I might wake any moment and discover myself back in my father's modest house. This entire experience, nothing but wishful dreaming." "Not someone else's life," Oswin corrected gently, stopping to face her fully, his hands taking hers with tender firmness. "Your life. The life we will build together. And I promise you, Annalise, it will not be governed by the same cold restraint that has characterized Calderfell for generations. You have already brought warmth to these halls simply by existing within them. As my Duchess, you will have complete freedom to make this house reflect your values, your kindness, your vision of what a great estate can be. I do not want you to transform yourself to fit some predetermined mold. I want you to transform Calderfell by remaining exactly who you are." She stopped walking and turned to face him fully, her expression serious, almost solemn. "Oswin, I need you to understand something. I'm not marrying you because of your title or your wealth or your position in society. Those things are impressive, certainly, but they are not what captured my heart. I am marrying you because when I am near you, I feel seen in a way I have never experienced before. Because your kindness is not performance calculated for social advantage, but genuine character emerging from deeply held principles. Because over the past 5 years, I have watched you move through society with such lonely dignity that I wanted nothing more than to ease that loneliness, even though I believed myself utterly unworthy of the role. You honor duty, yes, but you do so with compassion rather than coldness. That is the man I love, not the Duke of Calderfell, but Oswin Caldermere, the human being beneath the title. Unworthy. The word emerged sharp with disbelief and tender reproach. "Annalisa, you are the most worthy person I have ever known. You possess every quality that truly matters, compassion that sees individuals rather than categories, integrity that guides action rather than merely decorating conversation, strength tempered with gentleness rather than hardened into arrogance. If society measures worth differently, by bank balances and ancient bloodlines, then society is measuring with flawed instruments and reaching false conclusions. "Then we shall prove society wrong together," she said, her smile transforming worry into determination, vulnerability into shared purpose. "And perhaps in doing so, we will give others courage to choose love over expectation, authenticity over performance." They resumed walking, their path leading naturally toward the old stone chapel where Calderfell weddings had been celebrated for 3 centuries. Snow clung to the building's Gothic arches like delicate embroidery, and through stained glass windows, depicting biblical scenes of love and covenant, colored light spilled onto white ground in patterns of ruby and sapphire and gold, creating beauty from the marriage of ancient craft and natural elements. "I would like to marry you here," Oswin said, stopping before the chapel entrance, his voice carrying conviction born from deep certainty. "Not in London, where every detail would become social theatre, and our union would be dissected by gossips and strategists, but here at Calderfell, surrounded by family and tenants and the people whose lives are genuinely connected to ours. A wedding that celebrates what we mean to each other rather than what we represent to society. Would that suit you?" "It would suit me perfectly," Annalisa replied, her voice soft with emotion, eyes shining with unshed tears of happiness. "I have never wanted spectacle or performance, Oswin. Only honesty, genuine commitment, and the freedom to build a marriage based on partnership rather than social obligation or conventional expectation. This chapel, this place where your family has celebrated love for generations, it feels exactly right. Then that is what we shall have." He drew her closer, mindful of propriety but unable to resist the pull toward this woman who had become his anchor, his hope, his reason for believing the future could be radically different from the constrained past. "A small wedding in spring, here where your kindness first captured my attention, and my heart finally learned to speak rather than merely endure silent longing." They stood together in the chapel's shadow, 2 figures stark against white landscape, and made promises that required no witnesses beyond themselves, to choose each other daily, to build something genuine rather than merely acceptable, to remember always that love was not weakness, but the greatest strength either of them would ever possess. The remaining days of the Christmas season passed in a blur of planning, celebration, and the gradual adjustment to their new status as an engaged couple. Letters were sent to Annalise's family, who responded with joy tempered by understandable surprise that their daughter had captured the attention of one of England's most eligible and notoriously reserved peers. Her mother's letter was particularly touching, expressing happiness that Annalisa had found not just advantageous marriage, but genuine love. Oswin's solicitor was summoned from London despite the holiday, arriving on the 3rd day after Christmas to begin drafting marriage settlements. The arrangements Oswin proposed raised the man's eyebrows considerably. Substantial independent income for Annalisa, property held in her own name, legal protections far exceeding what law or custom required. When the solicitor delicately suggested that such generous terms were unnecessary, Oswin's response was firm. "Lady Annalise is not my acquisition, Mr. Thornton. She is my partner. These settlements reflect that reality. I want her to enter our marriage knowing she has both security and autonomy, that my love comes with respect for her independence rather than expectation of submission." Caroline threw herself into wedding preparations with infectious enthusiasm, consulting Annalisa on every detail while deliberately excluding the more mercenary elements of society who would have transformed the event into political theatre. The guest list was carefully curated to include people who genuinely cared for the couple rather than those seeking social advantage or gossip fodder. The chapel was measured for floral arrangements. The village seamstress, a woman whose skill had been passed down through 4 generations, was commissioned to create a gown that would reflect Annalise's natural grace rather than overwhelming it with fashionable excess. Through it all, Oswin watched his future wife navigate sudden prominence with the same authentic grace she had always displayed. She did not transform herself to fit expectations of what a duchess should be. Instead, she remained genuinely, uncompromisingly herself, and in doing so began transforming what Calderfell represented. The tenants responded to news of the engagement with overwhelming approval. They had known their duke as a fair but distant figure, respected but not truly known. Annalisa they recognized as someone who saw them as individuals rather than obligations, who remembered children's names and asked after elderly grandmothers with genuine interest. Her elevation to duchess promised gentler stewardship, a household governed by compassion alongside competence. One afternoon in early January, Oswin found Annalisa in the conservatory, where white roses still bloomed despite winter's grip, their perfume delicate and hopeful in the warm glass-enclosed space. She stood among the flowers, her expression thoughtful, one hand gently touching a petal, and when he approached, she turned with a smile that had become as necessary to him as breath or heartbeat. "I have been thinking," she said without preamble, her voice carrying excitement and determination, "about what it means to be a duchess, not in terms of social obligation or managing household servants, but real purpose that makes genuine difference. I want to expand the hospital program your mother started, ensuring every family has access to medical care, regardless of ability to pay. I want to establish a proper school for tenant children, not just basic literacy, but real education that gives them opportunities beyond what birth dictates. I want to use the considerable resources of this estate to create meaningful change in people's lives, to prove that privilege carries responsibility beyond maintaining appearances." "Then we shall do exactly that," Oswin replied without hesitation, taking her hands in his and feeling his heart swell with admiration and love. "Calderfell's wealth exists to serve those who depend upon it. I have always believed that in principle, but lacked the vision and frankly the courage to implement truly meaningful programs. With you beside me, we can transform this estate into something more than a monument to aristocratic privilege. We can make it matter in ways that outlast both of us." Her eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling radiantly. "You are not what I expected in a duke. You are so much better." "And you," he replied, drawing her close, "are everything I needed, without knowing how to define what was missing from my carefully controlled existence. Together, we are better than either of us could be separately. That is what marriage should be. Not diminishment or compromise, but multiplication of strength, vision, and purpose." They stood together among winter roses, planning a future that honored tradition while refusing to be imprisoned by it, and Oswin felt something settle deep in his chest that he finally recognized as genuine peace. For the first time in his adult life, he was not merely fulfilling obligation or meeting expectation. He was building something he genuinely wanted, with someone he genuinely loved, and the difference was as profound as the distance between existing and truly living. Winter gradually yielded to early spring, and with warming weather came final preparations for the wedding. The chapel was cleaned and lovingly restored, its ancient stones scrubbed until they glowed pale gold in sunlight, every detail attended to with care befitting the occasion. Annalisa's family arrived 3 days before the ceremony, her father's initial worry about the match dissolving completely when he witnessed the obvious devotion between his daughter and her duke. Even society's more cynical observers began to acknowledge that perhaps this was not strategic calculation, but genuine love, and if that shocked them, so much the better. On the morning of the wedding, Oswin woke to birdsong and the scent of apple blossoms drifting through his open window. Calderfell had dressed itself in spring color, gardens exploding with blooms of every imaginable shade, trees heavy with white and pink blossom, the very air perfumed with renewal and promise. It felt profoundly appropriate, this seasonal transformation mirroring his own journey from winter restraint to something warmer, more alive, more fundamentally human. The chapel filled early, tenants and aristocracy sitting side by side in a mingling of classes that would have been unthinkable at a more conventional ducal wedding. But this was not convention. It was celebration of something rare and genuine, and those present seemed to recognize and honor that distinction. Children from the village sat beside elderly peers, and the atmosphere was warm rather than formal, joyful rather than merely correct. When Annalisa appeared at the chapel entrance on her father's arm, Oswin forgot every carefully rehearsed word, every prepared sentiment. She wore cream silk that caught light like captured sun, with delicate lace that had belonged to her grandmother and wildflowers, primroses and violets woven through her hair. She looked beautiful, yes, but more than that. She looked happy, certain, entirely herself. And when their eyes met across the flower-strewn aisle, he saw his own joy reflected back, multiplied, made infinite by shared recognition that they had found something worth every risk, every moment of doubt, every year of silent longing finally given glorious voice. The ceremony was brief, traditional, weighted with vows that had bound couples for centuries. But when Oswin spoke his promises, to love, to cherish, to honor, he meant them with an intensity that transcended ritual. These were not words inherited from ancestors or required by social contract. They were his truth, freely offered to the woman who had transformed his understanding of what life could be, what it should be, what it would be from this moment forward. And when Annalisa repeated her own vows, her voice steady and clear despite the tears streaming down her face, he heard not just acceptance of his name and title, but genuine commitment to the man beneath, flawed, vulnerable, still learning to balance duty with desire, but finally brave enough to try, finally honest enough to acknowledge that love mattered more than reputation. The celebration that followed was joyful rather than ostentatious. Music filled the ballroom, food was shared freely, and for one perfect afternoon, Calderfell became exactly what Oswin had always hoped it could be, not a monument to power, but a home filled with warmth, laughter, and the simple pleasure of people genuinely caring for one another. As evening approached and guests began departing, Oswin and Annalisa, now duchess, now wife, now partner in all things, stood once more on the terrace where he had first decided to risk everything for love. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold and deep purple, and in the distance church bells rang a final time, blessing their union with sound that carried across fields newly green with spring growth. "Thank you," Annalisa said softly, her hand in his, her head resting against his shoulder, "for seeing me when I believed myself invisible, for loving me enough to risk society's judgment, for building this—" She gestured toward Calderfell's ancient walls, now warm with lamplight and life, "into something that feels like home." "Thank you," Oswin replied, his voice rough with emotion, "for teaching me that love is not weakness, but the only strength that truly matters, for giving me courage to choose differently than every man in my line before me, for making me believe that happiness is not frivolous indulgence, but essential humanity, and that I deserve to claim it as freely as any man." They stood together as darkness gathered, and stars emerged one by one, two people who had each believed love might pass them by, now joined in a partnership that honored both tradition and transformation. The Duke of Calderfell had finally learned what his ancestors never could, that the greatest privilege of power is the freedom to surrender it to something more valuable. And in his Duchess he had found not just a wife, but an equal, a partner, and living proof that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in maintaining silence, but in finally finding voice to speak the truth of one's heart. The future stretched before them, unwritten and full of possibility. Hospitals to build, schools to establish, lives to touch, love to share. And as they turned together to face that future, hand in hand beneath emerging stars, both understood that they had found something rare and precious, not just love, but the courage to honor it above all else. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this journey through Oswin and Annalisa's love story. Here at Echoes of Romance, we believe that true love, the kind built on patience, honesty, genuine respect, and the courage to choose heart over expectation, never goes out of style, whether in a Regency ballroom or our modern world. If this story touched your heart, we would be so grateful if you would subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about Oswin and Annalisa's journey from silent longing to spoken devotion. And give this video a like, so we can continue bringing you more beautiful romance stories that celebrate love in all its forms. And please, turn on notifications so you never miss when we share our next tale of love, courage, and happily ever after. Thank you for being part of our Echoes of Romance family. Until next time, may you always find the courage to speak your heart's truth, just as our dear Duke finally did on that magical Christmas night. Remember, love is never a weakness, but always the greatest strength we possess. The end.